Wow, we went from in waiting room to everybody's in. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to an amazing workshop late on the day for some of you. I know, wow, already there's like 17 people, Coleen and Greg. So that's awesome. So I am Jan Haskings, or Haskings-Winner. I use both names actually. So I'm on the executive of OHASTA, who is one of the subject associations sponsoring this conference. And I've known Greg for a very long time. We've gone back. I taught him it when he was a student teacher at OISE, and now he's teaching us. So that's a kind of a cool thing, right? So I have the honor of hosting this, and I will introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to pass it on to them, and I'm going to be the timekeeper, so keep us on time kind of stuff, right? So Greg Birkett is a published author, Black History, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas, published by Eamon Montgomery, as well as Great Black North Poetry Anthology from Frontenac House Poetry. He's an educator. He was won an award for AHEN, Excellence in Teaching Award, and he was also has written for the Ministry of Education and the Ontario Black History Society. He's co-developer and co-presenter of CS Learn Us, Teaching the Black Canadian Experience, a nationwide webinar for educators and education stakeholders in partnership with Nelson. And he has and continues to create materials and resources for their digital learning eco-base, as well as webinars and things like that. Some people have actually attended his webinars before. He's done some writing for CBC, the Kids website. He freelances for the Toronto Star and Sway magazine. He's a poet and playwright. He's had plays produced at the Toronto Fringe Festival, and he's a founder of GIA Productions, a youth-focused organization that uses artistic mediums of spoken word, drama, dance, and music. I've actually been privileged to see some of Greg's dramatic work in the past. He's appeared on City TV, Breakfast Television, City TV as an interviewee and expert panelist to discuss anti-Black racism, and is educational consultant. Coleen, who is his sister, in case you're wondering, because some people wonder what the connection might be if they have the same name, is also an educator with over 20 years. She's a little bit older, of 20 years of classroom experience. In addition to teaching, she's a freelance writer, has written many articles, publications. She's co-author of the book Black History, the one that Greg was a co-author of, which is in most school boards for the Black History course that Toronto District School Board actually piloted quite some years ago, actually. It's used in Nova Scotia and in Bermuda as well. She's also involved in the Ontario Black History Society as a curriculum writer and consultant. She's instrumental in providing leadership and development, organization, and facilitation of a very successful educational forums for youth during Black History Month. Her experience as an educator is diverse, as she's taught in Central America, Toronto, and Bermuda in both public and private schools, developed and presented workshops to educators in West Africa and Bermuda, so she's also a jet setter. She was selected to be a member of the evaluation team to assess a private school in New York for accreditation, and she was a recipient of the award for excellence in teaching for her work in Bermuda. Ms. Birkett has also worked as an instructional coach in the Toronto District School Board's Literacy and Numeracy Initiative, and she is teaching the Black Canadian Experience, a nationwide webinar, along with Greg, and she's doing that work with Nelson, the CS Learn Us. And both of them, I should mention, are both teachers. At the end of the day, that's what this is all about. It's about teaching, and they're both teachers in the Toronto District School Board, which is my former board as well. And now I pass it on to these awesome people.
Wow, thank you so much, Jan. And good to see you. And thank you so much to OHASTA for having us. And we're just going to jump right into things here. But first off, we're going to start off with the land acknowledgement.
Okay, so we acknowledge that we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit peoples. So having established that now, we'll continue with our presentation.
All right, so let's share our screen here and jump into it. Okay, all right. So everyone can see that, we're good? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So first off, I want to ask everyone, you can put this in the chat. When you saw the title for this particular this particular presentation, Decolonizing Our Pedagogy and Prioritizing Humanity, what was your initial reaction? What did you think that this might be about, right? So you can just throw some comments in the chat regarding what you thought this might actually be about, right? And we'll see then if, you know, some of your thoughts go along with what it is that we have to say on this particular topic. So please go ahead, throw some things into the chat there, and keep it in mind as we go along. Okay. Yep, anti-racism, danger of a single story. Awesome. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, you know, keep this in mind, or keep these things in mind as we go forward. Okay. So in thinking about, you know, the reason why we're here, the reasons why someone would sign up for, you know, something like this is, you know, we're all thinking about being better at our craft, at what it is that we do, which is teaching. So I want you to think about, you know, what a good educator is, right? What does it mean to be a good educator? And, you know, when I was thinking about this, you know, the public has so many different ideas around this. And then you watch a movie like, say, for instance, like Freedom Writers, and you see Hilary Swank, and, you know, she's put forward as you know, a good educator, and she had to sacrifice so much. You know, she ends up losing her family and all kinds of things. And sometimes that's what the public thinks a good educator is. But really, you know, I'm thinking a good educator is someone who is, you know, someone who is trying to get the best possible outcomes for students. Sorry, just give me one moment here. All right. Someone who desires the best possible outcomes for students, someone who's actively reflecting on their practices and holds themselves accountable in, you know, in different areas where they may be lacking, right? And then, you know, thinking about all of that, really the bottom line is that we want our students to achieve the best outcomes possible. And research indicates that there are specific groups of students nationally that are not achieving at the same level as their peers. Today, we're going to take a look at one of those groups and focus in on what we can do to better service that group. So just a quick snapshot here. Black student achievement across the country is you can see that in comparison to their peers, they're not performing at the same level. You know, if we look in Nova Scotia here, and this is just a quick snapshot, level 3 reading for grade 3, at expectations, Black students, 55% of them, whereas in comparison to their peers, 70%. And then if you look in grade 8, 5 years later, they're still being outperformed, right? In mathematics, again, a similar story, right? If we look at, you know, level 4, above expectation, only 7% of the Black students are above expectations in grade 4 math. And then in grade, again, in grade 8, at expectations, we're seeing that they're being outperformed. In the GTA, which is where I'm located, right? So we're looking at Toronto and then some areas around Toronto. Again, if we're looking at literacy here in grade 8, you can see that the South Asian population and then white students are outperforming their Black peers. And again, in the grade 12, at the grade 12 level for mathematics, again, we find that they're being outperformed. And I just want to share this stuff with you just so that we see that this is actually, you know, there is data that supports the fact that Black students seem to be being outperformed. You can look at, you know, the graduation and the dropout and suspension rates, and you can see there again that there are some issues that might be impacting their performance. In Peel, right, and this is Mississauga and Brampton and those areas, again, if you look at the pathways for Black students in grade 9 and 10. Most of them are taking, you're finding most of them in applied and locally developed. And then to pass the OSSLT, which is the test that's given to grade 10 students in order to get their high school diploma, most individuals that are in academic are successful, and those who are in applied, unfortunately, are not. And most Black students are in the applied and locally developed streams. Now, quickly in Montreal, or in Quebec in particular, what they found was students from the Caribbean are 3 times more likely to be identified as, and the acronym SHSMLD, and that students with handicaps, social maladjustments, or learning difficulties, and they're placed in separate classes for at-risk students. And this, of course, then dictates or has an impact on their outcomes. And in Toronto, again, where I work, Black students make up 13% of the student body, but only 3% are labeled gifted, compared to white students who are 1/3 of the student population, but more than half of them labeled gifted, right? So these are some of the impacts that we're seeing, and that are impeding the opportunities for Black students to achieve at the same level as their peers. So this group, Black students, are in need of a unique and an intentional kind of attention. And that's not that we're saying that this special and intentional kind of attention that Black students need should come at the detriment or would be ignoring other student groups. But what we're saying is Black students appear to be in crisis, and we definitely need to do what we can in order to address this crisis. So history reveals the past, explains the present, and informs the future. And if our system continues to approach educating Black students the same way, what we're going to have is the same outcomes, and this is going to go on for generations, right? So we definitely need to change our approach. So historian and professor at Dalhousie, Afua Cooper, some of you may have heard of her. She wrote a book called The Hanging of Angelique, and she's also a very well-known poet as well. She said that it's possible for an individual to achieve a post-secondary degree in Canadian studies and not know that the enslavement of Black and Indigenous people took place in New France and British North America for 200 years. And might I add to that also segregation as well, right? These are some things that we're finding that, an individual could attain the highest level of education and not know. So if there are gaps well, actually, let me move on first, and I'll address that afterwards. Between 1967 and 1971, Robin Maynard, she's got a book called Policing Black Lives. And this book is very important because it really historicizes the issue of anti-Black racism. Between 1967 and 1971, Canada got a new flag, a new national anthem, and it adopted the policy of multiculturalism. So Canada was really establishing its brand. And you don't think of a country establishing a brand, right? You usually think of companies establishing their brand, but countries do try to establish a brand globally, right? And Canada is wanting to have itself seen as an inclusive place that provides the greatest civil liberties and freedoms for all people. And most importantly, it's trying to separate itself from the United States. But in its endeavor to do that, right, what you find then is that certain narratives or certain parts of the national narrative are being left out. You can't try to brand yourself as an inclusive multicultural place and then teach about stolen land, enslavement, residential schools, segregation, head tax, internment camps, anti-Semitism, and all these kinds of things, because it doesn't fit with the brand. So with that happening, then what you're finding is there are going to be gaps, right? So again, with these gaps, if there are gaps in education, that means then that our educators are also going to have gaps. And if they're educating our students and they've got gaps in their education, then of course our students are going to have gaps in their education as well. There was an online survey given by York Region, And the answers that came out of this survey, and this survey was for community members, stakeholders in education in the community, some of the things that they had to say, and it was about key issues facing Black students. They had some things to say that were very revealing with regards to the attitudes that people have in Black student connected to Black student achievement. And I just wanted to highlight the last two comments here. I put a few of them up here, but it's very interesting to see what they had to say. So one of the comments here: no stable home life and parent involvement, too many single mothers, fatherless children, children out of wedlock, having children before they create a career, making bad choices. Parents and or community members of Black students are using race as a crutch for poor student performance, blaming systemic issues instead of working on building resilient, hardworking kids. Governments and school boards are thus lowering standards for Black students, and parents of Black students are not pushing their children to succeed and instead are blaming systemic racism. So it's interesting to note, according to these responses, the poor academic outcomes that Black students are experiencing board-wide, province-wide, nationwide, pretty much, in the West, are the fault of Black people, right? It's really, interesting to see that they're putting all of the blame on Black people and not necessarily, on some of the challenges that the systemic challenges that they face. So let's take a quick look at systemic racism and the fact that systemic racism is actually real, right? And these challenges that Black students face then impede or impact their ability to achieve. So for instance, Black women are 3 times likely in Canada, less likely to have a family doctor than white women. Unemployment rate, Black Canadians, the unemployment rate is higher amongst the Black Canadian population than it is in other segments of our population. So these are just a few examples of systemic racism that can impact Black student achievement. So systemic racism is real. So stemming out of systemic racism, there's some stereotypes, right? When some people see the high unemployment rate amongst the Black Canadian population, there's stereotypes about that come to the forefront about Black people being lazy and those kinds of things, without taking again into consideration the systemic impact that is actually there, that is prevalent. So where did these stereotypes originate? Black history, of course, starts before enslavement, but understanding the transatlantic slave trade explains why the world is the way it is today. So race as we understand it now did not exist prior to the transatlantic slave trade. There were different ways that people created separation in populations, but it wasn't necessarily through race. It was usually through wealth, right? So rich versus poor. But after the transatlantic slave trade, we see a shift, and the way that society separates itself after that is according to race. So systemic racism, anti-Black racism, discrimination, unconscious bias, as it pertains to prejudice and stereotyping, cannot be understood without knowledge of the transatlantic slave trade. All right. First and foremost, we have to acknowledge that enslavement in the Americas was not a color issue at first. So people, Black people were not looked at and seen as inferior, and therefore, they should be put to work. There were reasons outside of that, right? But that was used as a justification later on. But the first laborers were actually European indentured servants, and then the indigenous population in those regions, right? The reasons why they turned to to the enslavement of African people afterwards. There are 4 reasons here. African expertise in the cultivation of the cash crops that were being grown in these regions. The climate, of course, the climate that of these regions, particularly in the Caribbean and in the southern US and in South America and places like Brazil, where it was very similar to the climate in Africa. So Black people were used to working in those climates. The immunity to old world diseases, right? We know that when the Europeans had contact with the native populations. They were not immune to those diseases, but the Africans were, because they came from the same part of the world as the Europeans. So they didn't die off when they came in contact with the Europeans, because they had immunity to these diseases. And then, of course, they saw Africa as a steady source for cheap labor. There was already the sub-Saharan slave trade. So trade in human lives for materials was already happening in Africa, but the Europeans came along and sort of piggybacked on what was happening there, what was being done by the slave traders. So coming out of this, they had to justify why they were enslaving African people and why they were treating them like property and not people. So the moral justification, first of all, was the fact that they were civilizing them, right? And you talk about, there was talk of the white man's burden to the 3 C's: civilize, Christianize, and colonize, right? And they really believed that they were bringing civilization, or use that rather as a justification for enslaving Africans. And then, of course, there's the religious justification, and that's where they would take the Bible and interpret it, or misinterpret it rather, and take sections out of it and use that to justify why they were doing what they're doing. And then there's the scientific justification. You have people like Benjamin Rush, who was one of the founding fathers of America, who signed the Declaration of Independence, talking about things like Negroidism, and saying that Black people's skin, the color of their skin, was a hereditary skin disease that could be treated and cured. And all these kinds of things were used to say that, they were subservient or not equal. And then, of course, the economic justification, the fact that you need to have an exploited working class in order for a middle class and an upper class to thrive. So, often we don't talk about, or we don't hear about just how much of, or how long rather enslavement lasted in Canada, or that it even existed at all in Canada. And of course it did for at least 200 years. The first enslaved Black person doesn't arrive in Canada until the 1600s. Most believe it was around 1628, and he's a young boy from the island of Madagascar. And then, of course, there's this belief that slavery, if it did happen in Canada, it couldn't have been as bad as enslavement in the US. But of course, there is information that would contradict that. The fact that enslaved Blacks in New France really, didn't live past 18 years shows that, the conditions were not, were not easy. And it continued on in Canada, even after the British took over or defeated the French. The first time, well, actually, let me say again, Robin Maynard in her book, Policing Black Lives, she talks about the fact that seeking freedom is indeed one of the first crimes publicly associated with Blackness. So really, if you are owned by someone else, if you run away, you can be charged with stealing yourself, right? Because you don't own your own body. And this leads to heavy surveillance of Black people right off the bat in Canada. And then, something that really shatters the myth of Canada being this place of freedom for Black people. In 1777, Vermont becomes the first British colony to abolish slavery, and you actually have Black people running from Quebec and going to Vermont seeking freedom, versus the narrative that's always woven about the Underground Railroad in Canada being the place where people come for freedom. Right, so runaway slave ads are the beginning of linking Blackness to crime in public spaces, and as I mentioned before, this heightens the surveillance of Black people in public spheres. And the punishments, again, it was not enslavement here in British North America, which would go on to be Canada, was not something that was easier or more, was just more kind or gentler than what was happening in the US. And, they received the same kinds of punishments, lashes and being branded and burned and all those kinds of things, and rape. All of that happened here in British North America as well. Of course, Lord Simcoe comes in and he starts to slowly work towards the abolition of enslavement. And then in 1833, slavery is abolished in all British colonies. But Canada goes from that to then only allowing Black people to come if they're going to fill labor shortages, and only allowing them to enter to hold positions of servitude. From 1900 to 1932, you see men being recruited from Barbados and Jamaica to come and work in steel plants in Sydney, Nova Scotia, and they're put to work in the most dangerous positions because there is this belief that because they're from the Caribbean and because they're Black, they can work near heat, and many of them actually lost their lives working in these steel plants. And of course, then they also brought women in from Guadeloupe to work as domestics. And these both these groups of people from the Caribbean, even though they were recruited, they were seen as stealing, or the white Canadian population believed that they were trying to steal their jobs or accused them of stealing their jobs. Okay. Canada's reaction to Black immigration was not good. In 1911, Edmonton, the city council actually votes to ban Black people from entering the city. In Winnipeg's Dominion Commissioner of Immigration actually promises his constituents that he's doing all in his power to keep Negroes out of Western Canada. You have Wilfrid Laurier employing a doctor from Chicago to discourage potential Black immigrants and to tell them that the climate is not conducive to Black life in Canada, and he's rewarding border officials for disqualifying Blacks, and just doing all these subtle things to make sure that Black people do not have access to Canada. You have in 1868, Sir John A. Macdonald arguing to keep the death penalty, to try to slow down the frequency of rape committed by Negroes. At this point in time, there weren't many Black men here, but he was playing on this fear and this stereotype that Black men were dangerous, and he's playing on that to try to keep the death penalty here in Canada. And then you have the Imperial Order of Daughters of the Empire also appealing to the government to try to keep Black men or Black people and Black men in particular out of Canada because of their danger, in particular to white women, in proximity to white women. Prior to the 1970s, racial segregation was, it was a part of every facet of Canadian life. It was a part of healthcare, housing, employment. Even cemeteries were segregated, right? Segregated schools were, far and wide from the Maritimes through the West as well. And then in 1850, you have, in Upper Canada, Ryerson, basically putting the act out, the separate schools for Protestants, Roman Catholics, and colored people, basically, sort of putting this forward as, under the guise of trying to allow people to practice their religion and their culture, but really he was trying to separate Black students from going to school with white students. And the Black schools were not equally funded, right? Like the white schools, they were poorly heated, the teachers were paid poorly, the government pretty much abandoned them. And they were also located usually, quite a distance from the Black children. And if you didn't have the proper clothing, it was very difficult for you to be out in the winter walking to school. So then this meant that Black students were often missing classes. All right, the last segregated school in Ontario closes in 1965. The last one in Nova Scotia, 1983. I don't know about you, but 1983 is within my lifetime. 1965, no. 1983 within my lifetime. So within, for many of us within our lifetime, the last segregated school, was closing in Nova Scotia. And then, we like to talk about Viola Desmond, and everyone knows about Viola Desmond and what happened to her, but that incident did not happen in isolation. It happened, to other Black individuals in other provinces as well. So knowing and understanding Canada's long history of anti-Black racism enables educators to acknowledge that it exists, that it's entrenched in Canadian society, and that we need to take urgent steps to prevent it from continuing to hamper the achievement of Black students. So anti-Black racism impacts every public sector, as I mentioned before, housing, healthcare, education. It can be argued that anti-Black racism in education has a longer lasting and further reaching effect than its presence in any other public system. So now that we know this, what can we do? You know, there are resources, and we're going to talk a bit more about our resources, and Coleen is going to give you some more information with regards to that. But there are a lot of resources out there that you can tap into. And of course, these slides are going to be made available to you so you can see these resources as well. And we definitely want to talk about a cross-curricular approach so that it just doesn't just show up in social studies classes, but you know, it's something that is taught throughout our curriculum. All right, we have to go out of our way. We have to practice intentional inclusion. We have to acknowledge that our education system and curriculum are founded on colonial principles. And when we start to emphasize the humanity of each student over personal fears and biases founded in prejudice and stereotypes of ethnic groups, we start to move towards implementing teaching practices and interactions that place positive outcomes and achievements for all students above anything else. We can definitely do this. And Coleen is going to give you some practical things that you can use in the classroom.
Okay, so we've had pretty much a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the things in our history that are currently impacting the performance of our Black students in class. And so, you know, it was established that we need to allow Black students to see themselves in the curriculum in order to heighten their engagement and improve overall achievement. So the framework that we like to take, as Greg mentioned, we talk about a cross-curricular approach, and we also like to base this in longevity, identity, and contributions. So students need to know that there's been a Black presence in Canada since the 1600s. And the first Black man in Canada was not an enslaved man, but he came here as an interpreter for explorers, and he was able to actually speak the language of the indigenous people here. And so our students need to know that our first presence here was not through the institution of slavery. And then identity. Learning about Black Canadian history actually establishes the true identity of Blacks in Canada and erases the stereotypes that are perpetuated by the media. And then if we also focus on contributions, we see that Black people have made and continue to make vast contributions to Canada. And knowing this will help to change perceptions for all students and inspire all students towards greater achievement. So we're just going to very quickly look at some classroom activities that relate to topics in Black Canadian history and help students to embrace their longevity, identity, and contributions here in Canada. The format it will follow is, you know, just some low prep activities, because sometimes as educators, we're not as knowledgeable as we would like to be. And so we feel a little bit apprehensive about actually including this in the classroom. So there's some low prep things that you can actually do to start to bring some of this into the classroom. And then a few more things that require more prep. And then, as Greg said, the other focus that we like is cross-curricular. But because this is a social studies conference, we'll just look at some social studies courses that these things can actually be put into. But as you heard, Jan, in the introduction, through our CS Learner series, we actually show how you can integrate this in all subjects: math, science, English, history, of course, art, everything. We show you how you, phys ed, how you can integrate this. But today we'll just focus on social studies. So for example, remember dealing with longevity, you want to go back to the very beginning. So we could look at the Black loyalists, and here's a Heritage Minute on Richard Pierpoint that you can just show the students and then just have them write a quick summary on this Heritage Minute. So it's teaching them about a Black loyalist, someone who was here from a long time ago and who made an impact, who was actually able to help Canada during the War of 1812. Something that requires more prep then is you can have a class discussion or have the students research the impact of the Underground Railroad on Canadian society, or, you know, discuss and research some of the early Black Canadian settlements. And some fascinating things happened in these early settlements. settlements that focused around school and church and built strong communities and actually educated a lot of our Black people here very early in their presence here in Canada. And our students need to know about this. And then, courses in Manitoba where this would fit into, as well as in Ontario. We've listed some of the courses here. And as Greg said earlier, these slides will be available for you on the websites that are associated with this conference. And then they're also in a handout form, which should be posted as well. Under the theme of identity, again, if we look at Canada's historic Black communities, you can see the Black Canadian identity and the legacy of hard work and determination that was established by these communities. So we have the early Black settlements, and we have some other historic Black communities that a lot of people don't even know existed, and can really be inspiring, not just for our Black students, but for all students. So a low prep thing again would be just another video. This one is about Amber Valley, Alberta's forgotten Black community. Students can watch this, they can respond with what they learned. Why is this information useful or important? Now what? What can you do with this information? Very low prep. And then
Coleen, this is your 10-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. And then some things that require a little bit more prep. This is just a list of the many historic Black Canadian communities. And then you could actually have students do a jigsaw where they're learning about the different communities, whether they're doing a jigsaw on all the different communities or just on one community and different aspects of that one community. And again, these are some of the relevant courses that this can fit into. And then the theme of contributions. Having a knowledge of the achievements and contributions of Black Canadians helps students to be more aware of the fact that just as the Black presence in Canada spans hundreds of years, likewise, high achievements for Black Canadians has longevity. So integrating the study of these achievements across the curriculum can provide a source of inspiration for students and challenge them to succeed even when the odds seem to be against them, because a lot of these achievements came about when the odds were stacked against the people involved. So again, low prep. Here's a video about Jean Augustine. She arrived in Canada under the West Indian domestic scheme. So she came here working, looking after people's children in their homes, went on to become a teacher, a principal, and later a member of parliament. So just seeing that kind of a journey is really helpful to the students. And then requiring more prep. Again, you can have the students do some research about, past Canadians, because it's important to see that achievements and high standards are not just something from now, but it's something that's been in our past. And so it's all there. Again, you can take some time to read this later on. And here are some, the first Canadian-born Black doctor, 1861. This would probably be surprising to many students. First Black elected politician in Toronto, 1894. First Black person called to the Alberta bar, and the first Black female lawyer in Canada, 1954. First Black graduate from a university in Nova Scotia, and the first locally educated Black lawyer in the Maritimes was way back in 1891. And then we often hear about the Black classical singers in the United States, but we have one right here in Canada who performed in the United States and throughout the world, Portia White. So it's really important that our students learn about these, and it helps to heighten their engagement and instill in them the fact that they are capable of high achievement as well. And there's also a list of resources. And again, this will be posted on the website so that you can access this and read and find out more, and even find resources that can be used at the elementary level, the high school level, middle school level. So we'll leave it at that. There is, sorry, before we give you an opportunity to ask questions, there is a video called Suspect Black Male. And this is written by Greg and it's performed by Greg. And if you want to view the video, just to get some insight into, some of the feelings that are associated with this whole stereotype of the Black male being dangerous, then it shows you here where you can go to take a look at that. And so that's on Greg's Instagram page, Greg B_rights. And then here's where you can find us on Twitter, and on Instagram, and our email address. And the series See Us, Learn Us will be presented again. Right now we are solidifying the dates, but once we have that, we will post it on Twitter as well as on Greg's Instagram page. And so this leaves us a little bit of time for any questions that you may have.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening. And at this time, yeah, please feel free in the chat to ask any questions. We're open to that at this time.
Oh yes, Hubbard.
Okay, and again, See Us, Learn Us is it's a webinar that is a 9-part series, so we get a chance to really go more in depth. With some of the information that we presented to you just now. We gave you a quick snapshot of some of the anti-racism, the history of anti-racism, and some of the history of some of the challenges that Canada's Black population has faced, and of course, the resilience of the people and how they were able to overcome. But we go into more detail, and we are very intentional about showing the Black presence in Canada in every province, right? So it's not just focused on, Ontario, where, the province that has the biggest Black population, but throughout, right? So from BC all the way through to the Maritimes, we're very intentional about showing the Black Canadian experience in these provinces.
Okay. So we see a couple of questions here in the chat. How would you suggest educators address the challenge of covert and latent anti-Black racism? And then also on the heels of that, some people and sources of information tend to overemphasize the point that slavery existed in Africa before the slave trade. How should I address this claim? Yes.
Okay, so I'll start with the first one, with the last one and work backwards. So the fact that slavery existed in Africa is absolutely true. But one of the things that we have to understand is, first of all, the Arabs came in to Africa and set up the sub-Saharan slave trade. And with regard to slavery or enslavement in Africa, it was generally you're finding prisoners of war. And the enslavement that happened in Africa, and don't get me wrong, when I say this, enslavement is enslavement and it's just wrong. But enslavement that happened in Africa was different from the enslavement that we saw here in the Americas. An enslaved person in Africa had rights and could actually work their way back into society, right? Whereas in the Americas, once you were, particularly, your freedom followed, your status followed your mother's status. So if your mother was enslaved, then you would be enslaved. In addition to that, as I mentioned before, you had education and other systems, right? Science working together to say that the reason that Black people were enslaved was because they were an inferior race and they deserved to be, and it was supposed to happen to them. That wasn't the time, you didn't see that. You didn't see institutions like that working together in Africa to try to prove to those who were enslaved that they belonged there and that should be happening to them. So the enslavement that happened in Africa was very different from the enslavement that took place in the Americas, right? And in the Americas, then, as I said, it becomes racialized. It becomes racialized. Whereas in Africa, it was really prisoners of war. And as I mentioned, enslaved individuals could actually work their way out and become members of society again, and they did have rights. So it's different, and it was brought in from an outside. Again, the Arab population brought the sub-Saharan slave trade in. Another thing you'll often hear is people talking about the fact that African chiefs sold their other Africans into enslavement, and they often say, well, why would they sell their brothers and sisters? they didn't necessarily see themselves as brothers and sisters. They saw themselves as very different ethnic groups, right? So, you know, they were Black, right? But they didn't see them, like an Igbo saw themselves very differently from an Ashanti, right? So it wasn't about, you know, selling brothers and sisters into enslavement. They just saw themselves as totally different people groups, right? And then the other one, how would you suggest educators address the challenge of covert and latent anti-Black racism?
And Greg, you have 2 minutes to answer what is not possible in 2 minutes.
Okay, all right. So really, I think we have to talk about it. We have to highlight that it exists, right? That there is covert racism, and that's generally what we face in Canada, right? So there were studies done about the fact that if you have an ethnic or Black sounding name and you submit your resume, you know, to a company, you may not get a call back versus a name that sounds more, you know, an anglicized name, right? So often I would get a call, you know, Greg Birkett. Birkett is a British last name, and then when I show up, you would see the surprise on the employer's face when I show up. So I think one of the ways to really address and challenge covert racism is to discuss with students that it actually does happen and prepare them, you know, for the fact that this is something that, you know, it's hard to fight, but it's something that we do have to actually work towards fighting and addressing and eradicating. Sorry, I would like to definitely go into more detail on that answer, but I really don't have the time. But thank you all again so much for indulging us and for listening to our presentation here. Please feel free to reach out and contact us. The contact information below, and please register for See Us, Learn Us through Nelson. It'll be starting in either January or February of 2022, and we go into much more detail there, and we give you a lot of resources again as well. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you all very much. We really appreciate your attendance and your participation here today. And again, as Greg said, you know, we are available for, you know, other presentations and other boards or whenever. And thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg and Coleen, for your time and your wisdom and your resources. And of course, it's a long process. We don't make change in quickly, but having the conversation and being open to the conversation, I think, is the first step. So thank you for helping us move forward and participating. And thanks to our tech guy, Jeff, for keeping us on supported here, right? And thank to all of you participants for coming. And on that, I will call it a wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.